At 1 a.m. Moscow time on Tuesday morning, with the ruble at 66 to the US dollar, the Central Bank of Russia raised interest rates from 10.5% to 17% in an attempt to get the currency back up again. By lunchtime, London time on Tuesday, the ruble was at 80 to the US dollar. Neil, as the Eastern European editor, but really, I'd like to ask you from the perspective of Russian President Vladimir Putin, what to do next?
Well, that's the key question. I think if Vladimir Putin was what we might call sensible, then the key step would be not so much an economic one, but to signal that he is going to back down somewhat in Ukraine, that Russia is going to comply with the Minsk ceasefire accords in Ukraine, because that could then get the most recent sanctions lifted. And if you could get the most recent sanctions lifted, then there could be a return of some confidence in Russia and in the way Russia is being run, and a sense that things are moving in the right direction. So in my view, that would be the most beneficial thing that he could do. So in terms of a political response, if he doesn't do that, then I think stabilizing the situation will be very difficult. We've seen this big interest rate rise has made no difference at all. In fact, it seems to have made people panic only more. So in terms of other options, well, then you have to start looking potentially at capital controls, which will be enormously unpopular and seen as very much a retrograde step for Russia.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, later this week, Mr. Putin will do his yearly phone-in press conference with Russian citizens. So maybe that is a moment to signal over Ukraine that perhaps it is time for sanctions to be lifted. However, the Russian consumer is quite well known for retrenching quite severely in times of economic hardship. So would it really impose a political cost on Putin if the ruble is at 80 to the dollar and the economy is contracting quite sharply next year?
I think over time it will. You're absolutely right. The Russians are extremely resilient. They've been through a number of crises, much worse than this, much bigger than this, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They can take quite a lot of pain. We've also got very heavy state control of the media, which has been effective in blaming all of the economic woes on the West and on Western sanctions, and actually covering up in the policy mistakes or the absence of reforms that have led to some of this economic weakness and over-reliance on oil. But I think over time, if you see very high inflation, which with what's happened to the exchange rate, it looks almost certain, very high inflation next year, a potentially very serious recession, and living standards falling, which they haven't done at all under Mr. Putin in the 15 years that he has been the dominant figure in Russia, then over time that I think could begin to eat into his popularity quite seriously. And I mean, let's not downplay the seriousness of the situation. For a currency to move in effect 20% in half a day, I mean, it's quite an extraordinary move.
Now, given the absence of reforms you mentioned, isn't there an irony? Because obviously when the ruble is moving this quickly, it's very bad for large corporate borrowers of US dollars, such as Rosneft, for example. They may be asking for a bailout. Well, Rosneft in effect already is, but effectively they may need to have their US dollar debts refinanced or guaranteed by the government next year, the rate things are going. Can the government really do that and reform the corporate sector?
Well, I think in terms of reform in the coming year, all bets are off. I think it's we're going to see crisis management in the coming months and the next year at best. State companies are under a lot of pressure, not just state companies, but a number of the big non-state companies too have big debts, largely to Western banks. And the Kremlin is going to be under a lot of pressure to bail them out. Now, Russia does have still over $400 billion of foreign exchange reserves, but it could eat through those quite quickly. It's already blown through well over 70 billion trying to support the currency. Rosneft has been asking for a figure equivalent to 50 billion or more. So you can see that suddenly the 400 billion figure that they've got doesn't look as big as you might think when you look at the potential demands on it. And some of that money had been earmarked for other things, for example, as a pension fund. So Russia, I think, is starting to feel it doesn't have quite the cushion that a few months ago it seemed it did have.
In which case, hard choices ahead for Mr. Putin. And I shudder to think how much the ruble has moved while we've been talking. Thank you, Neil.